The first learning topic we will discuss this week is classical conditioning. Before I begin, I want to orient you with the definition of learning. Learning is far more general than the result of formal education. Any change in behavior or knowledge that is acquired through experience is learned. Learning can be conscious or unconscious. We sometimes have a tendency to attribute learned behavior to innate characteristics, but hopefully you will come out of this week with an enhanced appreciation of the role of experience in shaping a person's behavior. Classical conditioning is an example of associative learning, which is connecting stimuli in the environment to produce a particular reaction. It's important to understand the term stimulus and what it means in this context. A stimulus is an object or event that leads to a response in a given organism, a person, animal, insect, etc. Stimuli are key components in behavioral theories. They are linked to behavior whether they occur before or after a behavior. You'll see this term in all 3 mini lectures this week. It's also important to distinguish between learned and unlearned behaviors. Unlearned behaviors fall into 2 categories: reflexes and instincts. Humans are born with a known set of reflexes that are thought to be linked to survival. These include sucking, grasping, and the startle reflex in infants. The linking of reflexes to stimuli often forms some of the earliest instances of learning in a person's life. These also occur in animals. Instincts are more complex patterns of behavior that are not learned, just something an organism knows how to do. The example in the chapter of the loggerhead turtles going into the sea is one example of an instinctual behavior. Whether humans have instinct is a subject of a lot of debate. Some argue that certain behaviors, like sleeping, are so essential to our survival that they are instinctual. We don't need to be taught how to sleep. Others argue that because we can learn to inhibit pretty much any behavior, including sleep, we don't have instincts. Now we turn to classical conditioning. This process was discovered somewhat by accident. Ivan Pavlov was a physiologist who was studying the digestive systems of dogs. Some of his research involved measuring the saliva a dog produced when presented with food. He began to notice that the dogs would start to salivate even before being presented with the food. For example, when they heard the footsteps of the lab assistants coming toward him. This led him to set up an experiment to see whether dogs could be conditioned to respond to stimuli that were present in proximity to being given food. Pavlov's experiment went something like this. He decided to try to condition his dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. So he rang a bell every time he presented the dogs with food. After repeated exposures, the dogs would salivate at the sound of a bell, even when food was not presented. Here's the process of classical conditioning. Before the conditioning, there is a stimulus that naturally produces a response, usually a reflexive response. In Pavlov's experiment, the stimulus is food and the response is salivating. The food is an unconditioned stimulus because it naturally leads to the response, which is salivating. The response to the unconditioned stimulus is called the unconditioned response. It's natural, not learned. During conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, something that does not produce a given response. In Pavlov's experiments, the neutral stimulus was a bell. Ringing a bell does not normally produce salivation. The story goes that Pavlov repeatedly rang a bell as he presented the dogs with food. After conditioning, the previously neutral stimulus began to produce the response. The dogs began to salivate at the sound of the bell. The bell is now the conditioned stimulus, and the salivation at the sound of the bell is the conditioned response. Note that the conditioned response is the same response as the unconditioned response, but whether it is unconditioned or conditioned depends on the stimulus that produces it. Salivating at food is still an unconditioned response, but salivating at the sound of the bell is the conditioned response. You may have already seen the video clip from The Office that is linked in the chapter. If you haven't, please watch it and try to identify the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and the conditioned response. Higher order conditioning can occur when a conditioned stimulus is paired with a new neutral stimulus. Eventually, the new stimulus also can produce a conditioned response, as seen in the example with the creak of the cupboard door preceding the sound of an electric can opener, which the cat has associated with getting fed. If the owner decided to start feeding the cat from a pouch rather than a can, and they still kept the food in that creaky cupboard, the cat would still salivate at the sound of the cabinet door, even in the absence of the sound of the can opener. The conditioned response can be strengthened or weakened based on the consistency of the presentation of the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. Acquisition is the initial association of the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. A very short time interval usually is required for the organism to associate the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. If the bell was rung 5 minutes before the food was presented, the dog might not begin to salivate at the sound of the bell. In humans, this might not always be the case. If you got sick after eating something, even after several hours between eating and feeling sick, you might develop an aversion to that particular food. Extinction occurs when the conditioned stimulus repeatedly is presented without the unconditioned stimulus. When the bell is rung repeatedly without also presenting food, the association will weaken and eventually the dog will stop responding to the bell. Spontaneous recovery can occur if the conditioned stimulus is not presented for a period of time after extinction. If Pavlov stopped ringing the bell for a while and then rang it again, the dog might salivate again even after that response has been extinguished. The specificity of stimuli is also an important component of learning in the behavioral tradition. Stimulus discrimination is the ability to tell the difference between stimuli that are similar when one is paired with an unconditioned stimulus and one is not. Pavlov used a metronome in some of his experiments, only presenting food at one particular tempo. The dogs learned to associate that particular tempo with food and not the faster or slower ones which were presented without food. There needs to be the specificity in the presentation of the stimuli for the discrimination to occur. If the food was presented at various tempos, then stimulus generalization is more likely to occur. The dogs would salivate at the sound of the metronome no matter what tempo it was presented, because the metronome itself would be associated with the food. Habituation is a related concept. When a stimulus is presented repeatedly with no significance to the organism, they stop responding to it. This is used by researchers studying infant cognition. They measure the length of time an infant looks at an object to learn about what they might notice. They allow the babies to become habituated to that object and then change some aspect of it. If the infant looks longer at the changed object than they had been looking at the object once they were habituated to it, the researchers conclude that the infant noticed the change. Habituation also is involved in the treatment of specific phobias through systematic desensitization. Although Pavlov provided the initial concepts related to classical conditioning, Watson applied it to humans. He's considered to be the founder of behaviorism and he believed that all behavior could be explained in terms of stimuli and responses. He did a classic study, which today would be considered unethical, but which provided evidence of classical conditioning in humans. This is the famous Little Albert study. Watson worked with a baby named Albert and his mother. He used classical conditioning to teach little Albert to fear a white rat by introducing a loud clanging sound every time Albert saw or reached for the rat. The white rat became a conditioned stimulus for a fear response. Eventually, little Albert generalized his fear to other white fuzzy things, including a Santa Claus mask. This is an example of stimulus generalization, as discussed a few minutes ago. Inducing fear in a baby is ethically questionable at best, and this sort of experiment would never get through a human subjects review these days. If you look on YouTube, you might come across a video claiming that little Albert grew up to be a serial killer. Like a lot of things you might find on the internet, there's no evidence this is true. I'm not sure it's known what became of little Albert, so we don't know whether his fear was long-lasting. Classical conditioning operates in everyday life in a number of ways. Some common examples include what we now refer to as triggers. Stimuli in the environment can produce feelings of hunger or fear. How do you feel when you pass a McDonald's? Or maybe your favorite Mexican restaurant? You might suddenly feel some hunger pangs which were not there a moment before. Fear and anxiety and even PTSD also can be triggered by stimuli that have been associated in your past with traumatic or unpleasant events. Maybe it's the smell of the dentist's office or a kind of music played there. A song or smell can also produce feelings of nostalgia by taking you back to a particular time in your life or reminding you of someone important to you. Food and medicine aversions also can occur via classical conditioning. I used the example earlier of avoiding food that you might have eaten shortly before getting sick, even if it wasn't that particular food that caused the illness. The taste or sight of a particular medicine might also be difficult to tolerate if it leads to unpleasant feelings. I've seen this happen with my pets, when it was easier to get them to take a medicine the first time than it was on repeated times. They would associate the particular feeling, the particular way I gave them the medicine. I'd roll it up in some food or maybe crush it and hand feed it to them and they'd associate that with the feeling the medicine caused and refuse it the next time I try to give it to them that way. Children can form associations between stimuli present in schools and certain emotions. A student who struggles or who is bullied might learn to dislike or even fear going to school, while a student who has a more positive experience in school won't form that negative association. If candy is often given as a reward in school, the child might associate the school with candy and crave it while they are there. Finally, some therapies are based on the principles of classical conditioning. Systematic desensitization is a common approach used to treat phobias by presenting the feared object in controlled, safe settings, increasing the exposure until the person habituates to it. Aversion therapy is often used to break unwanted habits, like smoking. Sometimes medications are used to produce a highly unpleasant feeling if the person engages in the unwanted behavior, so that the person learns to associate the behavior with the unpleasant feeling. When you're finished with your work today, try to identify some ways classical conditioning operates in your life.